Welcome to Back in Crime, a podcast presented by Texas Crime Travelers. I'm Stewart Fillmore, retired FBI agent.
And I'm Todd Hiles, retired Secret Service agent. In this podcast, we cover cases we worked and some we wish we had.
As lifelong street agents, we were where the rubber met the road.
While the big guys were doing press conferences, we were interviewing the criminals.
And because of that, we can take you inside these cases
and under the crime scene tape.
This is Back in Crime.
Welcome to episode 3 of our 3-part series on newly discovered findings in the JFK assassination.
Hey everybody, glad to be back. This is going to be this is continuing some really compelling and interesting and important stuff.
And this is our final episode in this series. But Stewart, in episode 1 and 2, we discussed some compelling evidence regarding the possibility of a second gunman in Dealey Plaza that was in front of President Kennedy.
I believe was located in a car that's sitting on the top of what's called the South Knoll.
Also in those 2 episodes, we talked about testimony from the doctors at Parkland Hospital who treated President Kennedy. And that testimony helped you establish a wound path through President Kennedy that led to the discovery of that car in a famous photograph that no one really had ever noticed before.
Yeah. I mean, most people, I think, that have, had any exposure to the Kennedy assassination have probably seen this photograph. It's called Cancellari number 5. And really the purpose of the photo, I think, was the photographer was trying to capture the drama of 2 young parents on the ground protecting their children from gunfire. That was, that's the drama of the moment. But in doing that, in the background of his photo, he captured this area of Dealey Plaza called the South Knoll, which is, most people have commonly heard of the grassy knoll, which is on the north side of Dealey Plaza. Well, this is the mirror image of that on the south side. And there have been other researchers that have researched this, looked into it, the possibility of this shooter on the South Knoll based on the wounds of the president. I'm not the first to have done that, but I'm the first to have really zoomed in on the line that this wound path creates, and it points right to this car that's parked that you can see when you zoom into Cancellari's photograph. And even more damning, I think, Todd, is that there's a clear human shape within this car
that looks like it's sitting in there.
Yeah, that looks like it's sitting in the driver's seat.
Right. And we discussed this before. Why would you be sitting in a car when the president's motorcade is coming down the street?
Exactly. It just really doesn't make sense.
So in following up on that photograph of that car and finding that car, you next looked for any evidence behind the president's motorcade on that same line of that bullet path.
Yeah, so I reasoned that based on the elevation of the limousine and in the position where it was when we know that the throat shot happened, it would have roughly been level with where this car was. Okay, so it's basically a horizontal shot, but so that means that it had to go through the windshield. Now, there's a whole other controversy about whether there was a bullet hole in the windshield or not. That's something that maybe, if folks are interested, we can maybe do another episode on that at some other time, because I'm telling you, there's equally as much to say about that. For purposes of this discussion, though, I've kind of just stayed away from it and just have made the assumption that there's a bullet hole in the windshield. Okay. So, but because of that, you're talking about a bullet that would have gone through a windshield, which is going to lose a lot of speed, but it still inflicted a very clean, round wound in the president's throat, as described by the Parkland doctors. Okay, so that tells me that bullet didn't lose its true flight characteristics, and it didn't fragment. So I'm just thinking that probably didn't exit.
Right.
That's not consistent with what the known wounds that we know on the back of the president. But again, I set out on this thing to investigate it as if I'm going at it the first time, and all I can go on is what the
Parkland doctors,
what they've seen at Parkland.
Right.
So I just then thought, well, is there any evidence that would have of that if that bullet exited from behind, through the president, it would have kept going? Where did it go? And so I followed that same bullet path that's established by the wound in his throat, and again, right on that line are bullet holes on the face of the Texas School Book Depository.
And you found those recently
Just last September, in September of 2024.
We need to remind our listeners that 3 days before the assassination of JFK, the Dallas Times-Herald published the schedule and motorcade route of President Kennedy's visit to Dallas.
That's right, yeah.
So people knew where he was going to go. And, I would say that that's really a tactical error in planning for this visit. If that were to happen today, there's a huge possibility that the routes would be changed.
Big time, yeah.
And then let's also further remind our listeners that 2 days before the assassination of JFK, the Dallas police responded to a call regarding 2 men with a rifle near the South Knoll.
Yeah, and also remember this about those bullet holes that are on the Texas School Book Depository. Not only are they on the same line where the president was when this throat wound happens, that points right to this car, but in talking about this report of 2 men seen near the scene of the assassination, the report specifically said that they were sighting in a rifle. Okay, so I think that there's strong corroboration of that in that those 2 bullet holes that I saw, they're on 2 right pillars. The entrance of the building has 4 pillars, and there's 2 pillars on each side of the entrance. And on the 2 right pillars are where these bullet holes were, and they're both 9 feet 6 inches off the ground. Okay, strange there. The one on the left pillar is dead center at 9 feet 6 inches, and the one on the right pillar is off center to the right, 9 feet 6 inches. Okay.
What would explain to our listeners why somebody would sight in a rifle?
Okay, so why I think what that is you're checking your scope. You want to make sure that your scope is aimed precisely where that the rifle's going to shoot exactly where you have your crosshairs. And I think what we're seeing with those bullet holes is the first shot would have been to the right pillar because it's not centered in the pillar. He saw that, made the adjustment to the scope, and now the left pillar shot is dead center, but they're both at the same height. So, I mean, to me, that says this was deliberate, this was focused, this was aimed. This is not 2 kids out there plinking with a rifle.
So once their rifles were sighted in on that day, now they're ready for the day of the assassination.
Exactly. And again, it is a risky thing to do, but what better place to sight your rifle in and make sure that it's operating properly than exactly where you're going to use it? And I think it also allowed them to assess the sound.
Okay.
How much sound is this going to make? Do we need to have a suppressor on the rifle? Those kind of things. Where does it echo? Because all that becomes important later on.
We next discuss the Zapruder film and analyze the fatal headshot to President Kennedy and where that shot might have come from. So if you take all of your new findings, again, these are recently discovered by you. And what we're going to talk about in this episode, this investigation can be solved as to whether or not there was a second gunman.
After all these things lined up on the throat shot, finding this car, and I just thought, well, if all that adds up, that possibly this guy could have made the throat shot, and ballistically it all lines up, could this person in the car have also made the headshot? So I just started trying to figure out all the bullet trajectories, the angles, the line of sight, and all that kind of stuff for this headshot that most people, again, that are aware of the assassination know that you can see in the Zapruder film a very graphic explosion of the president's head, and it's further down Elm Street where that happens versus where the throat shot happened. And I think, based on my analysis, it's even the car is going to be lower than it would have been at the throat shot, so there's no need to shoot through the windshield. The shooter still would have had a line of sight from there. But most importantly, and this is something that we're going to get into further on this thing that's going to be super important, but most importantly, what the Parkland doctors saw was a gaping hole in the right rear portion of the president's head. And this right rear hole lines up perfectly to be made from that South Knoll position of where that car is.
Okay, so let me ask you this. do you believe there is sufficient probable cause for the issuance of a court order for a second autopsy of President Kennedy?
I think without a doubt there is, even without necessarily these kind of interesting things that I've found that, are new. The autopsy itself was just not good, and we're going to detail all that.
We'll get into that. And I think we've talked about this before of the second autopsy, and I'm going to admit that months and months ago when you first brought it up to me, I was like, "There's no way." The family, the country, they'll never let that happen, to let a former president be exhumed like this.
And I think that is most people's natural reaction. It really is. I think it's just natural to have that emotion, and that's exactly what it is. It's emotion. If you look at it logically, as we are trained to do as investigators, that this situation calls for, it almost demands a second autopsy. There's so many. The old phrase, leave no stone left unturned, right?
Right.
There's never been a such situation where that's more called for.
Right. And as we talk about this, it's going to be probably for the first time our listeners are going to be hearing this, but there is precedent in this because there has been a former president that has been exhumed, and a autopsy years after his death had taken place.
That's exactly right.
And that's former President Zachary Taylor.
Yeah. Who died in 1850.
Exactly. So here's the backstory on President Taylor. So on July 4th, 1850, President Taylor attends the groundbreaking of what will become the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And while he's at that dedication, it is noted that he ate some cherries and drank some milk. Later that evening, he becomes ill, and 5 days later, he passes away. No autopsy is conducted at that time.
Right.
The doctors who were treating him for his illness report that he died from a bacterial infection in his lower intestine. Now, just a quick side note. On July 10th, 1850, his vice president is sworn in as the new president. And again, this follows what is laid out in the U.S. Constitution. Now, you are retired FBI agent Stewart Fillmore.
Yes.
The vice president sworn in as the new president was Millard Fillmore. I got to ask you, Stewart, any relationship to the President Fillmore?
No. But I see where you're going with that, because you want to try to make this that I have relatives that were involved in a conspiracy to kill a president.
Right. Right. So,
So yes, I'm just trying to atone for the past.
So 140 years after President Taylor's death, his body is exhumed because there is an investigation to see if he was actually the first U.S. president to be assassinated.
Yeah.
They're looking into this conspiracy that maybe he had been poisoned. And if you read that case, it's very interesting because I think they really lay out that everything that President Taylor was for, Congress really needed him out of the way so they could do what they wanted to do.
Well, it was the backdrop was the issue of slavery. And was slavery going to be allowed in the expanding territories of the U.S.? And he was against that, and there were others that were for it. So that's the backdrop of what the theory becomes as to that he could have been poisoned.
Right, but a conspiracy.
Exactly.
To poison him. So this autopsy is completed. They actually look at his hair and fingernail samples are tested, and no poisons are present. They conclude that he died.
Well, I think there was actually a small amount of arsenic, but I guess it was normal for that time period.
Right.
It was nothing that would have been lethal to him.
Right, because they conclude at the end that he died of this natural bacterial infection. So his case is closed. There's no lingering conspiracy.
Right.
And as investigators, we know that second autopsies are routine and they're parts of cold case murder investigations.
Yes. and have a fairly high success rate.
Exactly. And,
But Todd, let go back to President Taylor just for one quick second. The whole case of this was a theory of an author about him being poisoned. I'm not sure exactly what her level of documentation was on that, other than maybe it was just a theory. But that pales into comparison of all the problems in the Kennedy assassination that are disputed.
Right.
I mean, it's not even close.
Right, yeah. There's a lot more
Oh man, yeah.
conspiracy in that one. So several months before JFK's assassination, a civil rights leader by the name of Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi, and this happened on June 12, 1963. In the 1960s, there's 2 criminal trials for his murder, and they each end in hung juries. But in 1991, his body is exhumed from Arlington National Cemetery, and a second autopsy is conducted.
Yeah, and a very successful second autopsy.
Right.
Yeah.
Because actually, based on evidence from the second autopsy, a third trial happens, and now the defendant is convicted of Evers' murder.
Yeah, that was a guy named Byron De La Beckwith. And the reason that they did a second autopsy is there had been so much time that had passed since the initial case and the initial trials that the autopsy that was done at the time, the report from that had gone missing, evidence had gone missing. So after 31 years, the second autopsy still was able to find a bullet path through Evers and still recover bullet fragments.
That's incredible.
It's absolutely incredible. And it goes to this notion that a second autopsy, when justified, is demanded by justice.
Exactly. The second autopsy, now we know it can be done, and it could be beneficial in this JFK assassination.
Absolutely, it could. Yes. And again, talking what we earlier about just people emotionally react to that, and I get that. I really do, because it's something that we tend to think you shouldn't mess with the dead, let them rest in peace. And that's all valid. It really is. But there's so much controversy in this case that has lasted for so long. And there are people of good faith who dispute the findings in this assassination. And when these things happen, unfortunately, you have to look at these things logically and go past emotion. And if you look at it logically and reasonably, there is really nothing else. There's no other path to consider. This is, again, I said it's demanded by justice in this.
Right. So in this final episode of our JFK Assassination series, let's pick up where we left off in episode 2, and that is at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas.
This episode contains graphic descriptions of gunshot wounds and related medical procedures. These topics are discussed due to the nature of the episode, and some listeners may find the content distressing, so please listen with care.
Now, we know that approximately 12:30 p.m., the president was shot while riding in the motorcade, and immediately the motorcade proceeds right to Parkland Hospital.
Yeah, I mean, they put the pedal to the metal.
And once at the hospital, medical treatment stops, and a Catholic priest is summoned to administer the last rites, and at 1 p.m., President Kennedy is declared dead. That's 30 minutes after being shot.
Yeah.
And normally, an autopsy is performed in the county where the person has died.
Yep.
In this case, the Dallas County Medical Examiner. And when that medical examiner is finished, the body is released to a funeral home.
Correct.
And we should note that in Dallas County, had the autopsy occurred there, this autopsy would not have been their first autopsy involving a gunshot or a homicide.
Yeah, we'll touch on that detail later.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the afternoon in Dallas, Texas. That afternoon, right? There is a lot of confusion. There's a lot of chaos.
I can't imagine how chaotic it was and stressful.
The leaders of either the Secret Service and the FBI, they're all trying to decide who is going to even be the lead agency in investigating this. I know Dallas PD was saying that the homicide occurred in their city, that they should be in charge. We should note that up until this time, there was really no federal law related to the assassination of the president.
That's right. There was no federal law on that, so this would have been a state crime.
Right. So, deciding on jurisdiction at that time, and who's actually in charge, these were difficult decisions that were made on the fly.
Everything that you just said is correct. You have a murder in Dallas County. That is the jurisdiction where this murder should be investigated. There should be an autopsy there, then taken to a funeral home and all that. And that's typically, that's the way it should be done. The problem is this is the president of the United States, and there's
Right.
a lot of other factors to consider.
Right.
So it cannot just be simply written off as, oh, well, they screwed up and the Secret Service, broke the law and stole the body. It's
Right.
it's more complicated than that.
Right. And I think, as a retired Secret Service agent, I have to put myself in the shoes of those agents that day and look at this and say, we still have a job to do, and that is now protecting soon-to-be President Johnson, the
That's
vice
right.
president. And at the time, the Secret Service feared that there may be a larger plot against the U.S. government, and they wanted Vice President Johnson to leave Dallas.
That's right.
And Vice President Johnson at the time, he's on the phone with people in Washington, D.C., and those people in Washington, D.C. want him immediately to return to Washington, D.C. They want him to leave Dallas, but he says, I am not leaving Dallas without Mrs. Kennedy.
And Mrs. Kennedy was not going to leave Dallas without the body of her husband.
Right.
So and I 1,000% understand all of that. Yep.
So around 2 p.m. now, the president's body is transported from Parkland Hospital to Love Field, and it's placed on Air Force One.
Yeah.
But before the plane takes off, Lyndon Johnson, who had been in the motorcade with President Kennedy and had actually gone to Parkland Hospital, he takes the oath of office and he's sworn in as the president.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of controversy about that because technically under the law, he became president the instant that John F. Kennedy died. There was no need for an oath of office. It was really just a formality.
And I think this swearing in on Air Force One, that's kind of a famous photo that's out there.
Yeah.
With Mrs. Kennedy that's standing right there.
Yeah, everybody's seen that photo. But, from that same series of photographs that were taken, it wasn't just like the photographer took one photo. There's a whole series of them. One of the photos taken that moment of that swearing-in ceremony, Congressman Albert Thomas of Texas, I think he was from Houston, is seen winking at LBJ. And LBJ, his head is turned away from the camera, but you can see that he's smiling. And contrast that with Jackie Kennedy, who's standing right next to him in a blood-stained dress. And no doubt, with this look on her face, that she's in the deepest despair of her life.
Right.
And it's just horrendous. And it's just, I find it just actually utterly revolting that this congressman is taking that instant to wink at his buddy.
Right. So at 2:38 p.m., Air Force One departs Love Field en route to Andrews Air Force Base with now President Johnson, Mrs. Kennedy, and JFK's body.
Yeah.
And after arriving at Andrews Air Force Base, JFK's body is taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital. And that's at the request of Mrs. Kennedy.
That's right, because JFK had been a Navy man.
Right. And I think normally it probably the body would have gone to Walter Reed Hospital.
Yes.
And that's going to be, we're going to talk about that here in a second. Again, why they picked that hospital, but again, they did. Mrs. Kennedy wanted it, and that's where the autopsy is performed.
Yep.
And now this autopsy is conducted by Navy pathologist James Humes and J. Thornton Boswell. Now, there is some discussion regarding their qualifications to perform a gunshot autopsy.
Yeah. Because neither one of them had ever done that before.
Right.
This was their first time doing it.
Right. But they do bring in a Army pathologist who has expertise in wound ballistics.
Wound ballistics, but again, he's also not a forensic pathologist, which is a doctor, a medical doctor that studies unnatural deaths such as gunshots and stabbings and blunt force trauma, those kind of things, as opposed to a pathologist that studies how someone might have died from a disease.
Okay.
Yeah, very important distinction there.
And this autopsy begins around 8 p.m. that same evening that he was assassinated, and it ends in the early hours of the next day. And their autopsy findings are going to be that President Kennedy had been struck by 2 bullets, both from the rear, one in the back of his head and one in his back.
Yeah.
And now before, and going back to before Air Force One left, I'm just going to add, before Air Force One left Dallas, Texas, Lee Harvey Oswald is already taken into custody by the Dallas Police Department.
Yes.
And they're already investigating him, not only for the murder of a Dallas police officer that afternoon,
Yeah.
but his involvement in the assassination, because they've figured out he is the only unaccounted person from the school book depository.
No question, Oswald did some suspicious things after the assassination. He went by his rooming house. Well, in fact, on his way he took a cab back to the rooming house. He has the cab drive by the rooming house a block and a half away so that he can, I guess, I don't know, he's trying to see if anyone's there looking for him.
Right.
So he walks back to the rooming house. He encounters the housekeeper there who speaks to him. He ignores her, blows past her, goes in, changes clothes, comes back out. He just blows past her. And she's talking about, hey, this assassination, this is something a normal person would have stopped and discussed this.
Because she was watching it on the news.
Yes. And shortly after that, Officer Tippett is murdered. So there's some very suspicious behavior on Oswald's part, for sure.
And also, at this point, when Oswald's taken into custody, they've already found the stuff up on the 6th floor of the school book depository.
Mainly shell casings and a rifle.
And the rifle, right. So now, wasn't there around this time a Department of Justice memo written that basically states that the investigation must determine that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
Well, it was 3 days later. It was on Monday. The assassination was on a Friday, and what's called the Katzenbach memo was written on Monday.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did that memo
So
state?
Nicholas Katzenbach was the Deputy Attorney General, and that Monday he wrote a memorandum that I'll just read part of it, and this will give you some flavor as to what the mindset was. Quote, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large, and that evidence was such that he would have been convicted at trial." So within 3 days, they've already made the decision Oswald acted alone. We're going to convince the public that he had no one working with him, and that our evidence is so strong that we would have got him at trial.
And that's crazy, because the investigation can't even be completed in 3 days.
Absolutely not.
And they've already come to a conclusion.
Yes.
So that's just crazy. Now
and J. Edgar Hoover wrote a similar memo that was released a few years ago, but very similar tone and direction.
And again, J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI at
Yes.
the time. So now we've talked about this before, about the Warren Commission, and that's created, probably a week or two after the assassination it's created. And I think in 1964, that commission that investigates the assassination, they issue their final report.
Yes.
And they conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And then their report also adopted the autopsy findings without criticism.
Yeah, without criticism, just hey, that's what it is, and so that's what they adopted.
Now, later, years later, there's going to be 3 additional government investigations. There's the Clark Panel in 1968, the Rockefeller Commission in 1975, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And they all found various problems with the autopsy, but they also adopted its basic findings of 2 shots from the rear.
They did. To me, one of the most glaring issues was in the initial autopsy. The report states that the shot that hit the president from behind in the head entered near the level of the external occipital protuberance, that bump that we all feel in the back of our head, the EOP as it's called. Well, the Clark panel, in reviewing the autopsy materials, concluded that this EOP shot was actually 4 inches higher in the crown of the head, or the cowlick area, higher up, and they just made this decision based on their analysis of photographs and x-rays. But the point is, how can the actual autopsy doctors who were there examining the body make a 4-inch mistake? Now, 4 inches may not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about precisely locating gunshot wounds, it means everything.
Exactly.
And it is an absolutely glaring issue. And in later times, the Humes and Boswell will waver on, well, yeah, maybe we made a mistake on that location of that. And then they went back to it and said, no, we were right. So that is a big, huge problem.
And we know that the House Select Committee on Assassination, that they actually criticized the competency of the autopsy. In fact, I think you have a quote from them that says,
that the HSCA, the House Select Committee, they did their investigation lasted 3 years, so they have a very extensive report, but this is just part of what they said about that autopsy. Quote, a combination of strong Kennedy family desires to finish the autopsy quickly, a military environment that hindered independent action, a lack of experience in forensic pathology among the prosectors, that's another term for autopsy doctor, and a lack of established jurisdictional and procedural guidelines all contributed to the pathologist's failure to take certain measures essential to the completion of a thorough medico-legal autopsy and to completely perform the autopsy, unquote.
Wow. If that quote is not enough to indicate mistakes, we know that the HSCA also pointed out several procedural errors.
Oh, they kept going.
Right.
they kept going.
And so let's look at some of their errors. Number one, they said too many non-essential persons involved.
The whole place, there's conflicting estimates of the number of people there. There were a couple of FBI agents that were there to document the whole thing. They have a list of some of the people. There are others that were supposedly there. I don't know exactly what the number is, but the place was jam-packed with military officers, and apparently it was that created chaos and confusion. It put pressure on these autopsy doctors that otherwise they wouldn't have had.
Right, because I guess there were people saying, hey, we should do this or stop this or
exactly
don't do
right.
this.
Yes, there's even testimony from Dr. Fink, the Army pathologist, in a later trial in 1969, where he talks about that there was a certain general who was giving orders, and this general was not a pathologist and didn't have any kind of expertise, and so shouldn't have been doing that.
Another procedural error was, they failed to consult the Parkland doctors prior to the autopsy.
Didn't talk to them at all, and that is a standard kind of thing to do in that situation, to find out what the initial observations were, and to see what's important here. Is there something that we should know? Well, the big thing was, because they didn't talk to the Parkland doctors beforehand, they didn't even know that there was a gunshot wound to the throat. What they saw was an incision that Dr. Malcolm Perry had done trying to save the president's life by doing a tracheostomy, and they just assumed that was a tracheostomy and didn't even know it was a bullet wound. So, and they didn't find that out until the next day, after the autopsy was already complete and the body had already gone to the funeral home. So, big problem there.
They failed to examine the clothing, which could have indicated trajectory.
So one of the big problems is the president has a gunshot wound to his back, and talking about the controversies between all these different government panels that looked into this, there's honestly, I think it's in the Rockefeller Commission, There's some disagreement about this wound to the president's back that makes it sound like it's almost that it's an exit wound, or is it an entrance wound? There's there's just a lot of controversy. But the big thing about the autopsy was there's not a specific measurement as to the location of that wound. Now that back wound is important because it's what the Warren Commission essentially concluded under their theory that what's called the magic bullet, that this back wound was the entrance wound for the magic bullet, the one that then goes out Kennedy's throat and then strikes Governor Connolly and creates 7 total wounds in 2 men. And what's important about that wound is it has to be at a certain height on the back for the trajectory to match. There's some conflicting accounts of the height of this wound. So the president's suit coat and shirt both had bullet holes that were about 6 inches below the neckline. So that is pretty consistent. Now the coat was a little bunched up, and there's some controversy about that. As we've said before, there's almost literally no aspect of this case that there is not some controversy. But I think the shirt is much less prone to bunching up the way a suit coat would be. And it is the bullet hole in the shirt is also about 6 inches below the collar.
Okay.
So again, yes. So those kind of things. So they didn't examine those clothing. So they didn't know that the level of those bullet holes.
And going on, they failed to determine the exact exit point of the head bullet.
Part of that, I'll give them a little leeway on that, because the head was. We can tell from the Zapruder film it was a massive explosion, and so the head was in pieces, and there were skull fragments. I'm sorry to be graphic on this, but there were missing skull fragments, and it was like a shattered eggshell, for lack of a better description. And so sometimes it's not as simple as maybe a wound to the body, where you can clearly see an exit wound or an entrance wound. In this situation, you're talking with something that's just been shattered, and so it's not as clear on that.
And they failed to dissect the back and neck.
That's one of the ones that is a real problem. Again, going back to that back wound that supposedly is the entrance for the magic bullet. Initially, in the autopsy report, it's described that they cannot easily probe this wound, and there's further descriptions about Dr. Humes actually putting a finger in this wound to try to probe it to see where it goes, and it was a very shallow wound. Well, that's curious, because if this is the magic bullet wound, then you should have a bullet track for it.
Right.
So, and if you can only probe it maybe an inch or so, that's a curious problem that I've never quite heard a good explanation for. So that demands a dissection of the wound, which is very tedious and very invasive. But again, this is a murder case, and we need to know these precise details mean a lot. They're so important.
I think at the time that they're looking at that back wound, they're actually feeling that the bullet is going to be still in the body. And at this time in the autopsy, I think an FBI agent runs into the room and says, "Hey, they just found the bullet on the gurney."
And that's when they see, and that's the other thing. So because they had not talked to the Parkland doctors, they just made the assumption, oh, well, that bullet just fell out.
Right.
One of the things that they base that on is, the president was still alive when he got to Parkland Hospital, and they did, at the time, I think they called it a chest massage. We call it CPR. They were pounding on his chest to help his heart circulate blood. And in the process of doing that, the autopsy doctor speculated that the bullet that had lodged in his back just fell out, which I've heard certain pathologists named Cyril Weck say, that ain't going to happen.
And I think one of the biggest procedural errors, and the last one we'll talk about, is their failure to take proper and sufficient photographs.
Again, here's a whole other controversy. Could probably be a whole episode just on the photographs and x-rays of the autopsy. the photographer and the X-ray technician both later described all the various photos that they took, and those what they described as taking are not currently in the photographic record at the National Archives. So, there's an issue. But of the photographs that we do have, I know that there's a lot of discussion and complaint about the lack of clarity in the photographs. Some of them are far away. You don't have. It's just not typical of what you would see with autopsy photos.
Right. And I think the last error that they talked about here, and I know this is a big one for you, because they failed to section the brain to allow more of a description of any bullet wound paths.
Another topic of controversy that where we could do probably a multi-episode thing is what happened to JFK's brain. Apparently the brain is missing. I have not fleshed out completely in my research what the entire saga of the brain, but just to quickly describe this, the brain itself has maybe the texture of Jell-O in its natural state.
All right.
And that does not lend itself to, when you talk about sectioning a brain, what you're talking about is basically slicing it like a loaf of bread. And in doing that, you can determine a bullet path. You can determine
the direction of travel.
Exactly. But you can't do that without chemically altering the brain. And that is, it's a substance that's injected into the brain called formalin. It takes a little while for that to set. And when I say a little while, I'm talking a few days, actually. So the autopsy of the brain was actually done. And again, the documentation on this is murky at best. So, but the autopsy on the brain was done subsequent to this. And again, there's certain pathologists that say it couldn't have been done. It would take a week for this to be done, for this formalin to set properly. And there's accounts that the autopsy of the brain was done a day later.
Okay.
So again, there's so many problems here that it's so many unforced errors, I guess is the way to say it.
And just think, we're both criminal investigators. And had we taken something to trial, let's say we just took a murder to trial, and the judge hears, or the judge makes that quote that they made about the autopsy that you read, or if any of these errors were present, I think the judge would probably, dismiss the case immediately?
I don't know if he would have dismissed it immediately, but it certainly would be a strong case for that there's reasonable doubt.
Yeah, or, again, if you're a jury, if you're on that jury and you're hearing this, there is, you have to come to that conclusion that there is reasonable doubt in the evidence being presented in that trial.
I think so many people look at this emotionally, and we've heard for so long, or at least in my case, that Oswald acted alone and that he's the man, and you just have it in your brain and your subconscious that Lee Harvey Oswald's guilty. But if you back away from that and you look at this and you forget all the emotion that's around it and all the stuff that we've heard over the years, and you just look at it as a case right now that you're going to take to trial, man, I would not. It's maybe as strong as maybe the case sounds against Oswald. There are a lot of problems with it, and I think an objective jury could find reasonable doubt.
And we know that there have been numerous books written just about the problems with just the autopsy.
Yeah,
not and those books don't even talk about Oswald. They just talk about this autopsy.
Yes,
and the problems that they had was there. I know. We came across that one article that talked about all the issues related to it. But one that really struck me very odd is that, again, this Navy doctor, Dr. Humes, he burned and destroyed his original notes.
Yeah.
There's missing photographs, missing X-rays from the autopsy file. To me, that's just crazy that happens like that.
I know. So I am not enough of an expert to talk about the specifics of how photographs can be altered, or what evidence you might see in a certain photograph of whether it's faked or not. But one thing I did find in looking at this is if you look at the Zapruder film frame by frame, especially after the fatal headshot, and you can see the damage to his head. And one of the things you notice is there's a flap of skull that falls down over his ear, his right ear. And the crease of this flap of skull, for lack of a better term, I'm sorry, runs roughly horizontal. Okay? When you see this certain autopsy photograph of the back of the president's head, you can see a flap of skull, but the crease of this flap of skull is lying vertically. So one of those, they can't, again, those cannot mutually exist. So there's a problem there.
Right. And you brought the Zapruder film. Again, if you closely watch that, there's those couple frames where we clearly see Mrs. Kennedy climb onto the back of the limousine to retrieve fragments from behind the president's body.
Yeah.
And so it's, what is she trying to pick up back there?
Yeah.
But, I think one of the biggest issues really is this, and that is that there were 40 professionals with experience in medical trauma, law enforcement, and autopsies, and they described seeing this gaping hole in the rear of President Kennedy's head.
Yeah.
Again, part of his skull is missing.
Yeah.
And this hole would be created by an exit wound, not an entrance wound.
That's exactly right.
And
yeah,
again,
Dr. Kemp Clark, he was the chief neurosurgeon at Parkland Hospital, described seeing this gaping hole, and that he even went more specifically and said that there was lacerated cerebellar tissue exuding from the wound. That's a specific part of the brain that lies at the bottom and to the rear, and the angle, again, going back to the angles of bullet paths and those kind of things. I know that's sometimes somewhat tedious details, but for that shot, for that part of the brain to be lacerated, that is cut and torn, the ballistics or the bullet paths work from that position of that South Knoll car that we talked about earlier.
Right. And again, these observations of these 40 professionals, and again, like you said, they're Parkland doctors.
Yeah.
They're FBI agents. They're Secret Service agents.
Yep.
There's funeral home specialists. There's autopsy personnel. Their observations don't compare with the official autopsy photo of President Kennedy's head, which shows it to be completely intact.
Completely intact. In fact, his hair looks actually somewhat kind of neatly combed. It looks wet, even, in fact. So it's completely at odds. And again, you have to think, really, like, for instance, going back to the HSCA for a second, they realized this same dilemma. And they tried to just say that in the heat of the moment, the stress, the chaos, and we acknowledge that this all would have been stressful and chaotic, that the Parkland doctors just simply made a mistake in what they saw. So I find it frightening that a team of trauma doctors who saw gunshots every day, that a neurosurgeon just imagined seeing a big hole in the back of the president's head with cerebellum oozing out of it.
Right.
So it's a little scary.
So there's really,
he's going to make that kind of mistake.
Right. So there's really no way that these two circumstances can even exist. Either these 40 qualified professionals, they're lying, or the autopsy photo is fraudulent.
That you can't have, that there's really no middle ground in there at all.
And it goes back to what you're saying, is that we have to have a modern and thorough second autopsy, because could that autopsy determine there's a gaping hole that these 40 people saw?
Absolutely. Yes. Now, I know there was extensive work to reconstruct his head for the funeral. I don't think there was an open casket, but nonetheless, I think they prepared as if there would have been. So there is going to be some type of material maybe that the funeral home used to reconstruct his head so that it looked somewhat normal.
Okay.
That no doubt that tissue, whatever that type of material they would have used, will still be there. Bodies decompose in different ways based on the environmental conditions of that particular grave. Sometimes graves leak, and water gets in there. Water can be very damaging. So we just won't know until it happens what the condition of the tissue is, and that But this, as far as the bones, the skull, those kind of things, that will all be intact. And the main issue, as you said, of this case, really, you can boil this whole assassination conspiracy thing down to this issue of, were these 40 people lying or grossly incompetent, or is there a gaping hole in that right occipital region of the president's skull?
All right. So if they do a second autopsy and there is this gaping hole, it exists, it's in the back of the head,
Yeah.
What does that mean then?
Well, it means that there's a shooter in the front, because that's an exit wound. So that means there's a shooter in front of the president, and we also know that there's a shooter in the back. So that's two shooters, and two people working together is a conspiracy.
But I guess what that would really mean then, more than just that, is that our U.S. government has lied to us then for 61 years.
For 61 years. Wrap your head around that one.
That is just crazy. But why do you think they lied? Or why do you think they are lying?
So, I've pondered this myself, because it's very troubling to me. Because fortunately, in my career, I never encountered anything where someone asked me to write a fraudulent report, to alter any evidence, to say anything that wasn't true, or to investigate anything that wasn't appropriate or legally justified. I know that there's allegations of that happening. I know it's happened in other circumstances and so forth. I'm lucky that I just never encountered that and never saw it.
You never saw it.
Okay. But so acknowledging here that there's a possibility here that our government is lying to us, for me, I guess I'll say it's an emotional thing, because it's hard to accept, because we want to have faith in our government, but you can't, as an investigator, you can't brush away a lot of this stuff.
Right.
So I've tried to just get at, well, why would they have done this? Why, if they are lying to us, then why would they lie to us? What is it? So all I know is that, going back to that Katzenbach memo, another thing that the Deputy Attorney General, that he wrote the memo the Monday after the assassination, saying that Oswald acted alone,
right,
and that's what we're going to focus on. He also wrote that, quote, speculation about Oswald's motivation ought to be cut off, and we should have some basis for rebutting thought that this was a communist conspiracy, or as the Iron Curtain press is saying. That's in the Iron Curtain means the communist world.
Okay.
That this is a right-wing conspiracy and to blame on the communist. So I know also from some recorded conversations of President Johnson that he thought that possibly, if this was a conspiracy, if say Russia or Cuba had killed the president through some kind of conspiracy, that the American people would demand retaliation, and that retaliation would lead to nuclear war, and in LBJ's words, 40 million people could die. And in fact, that was really how he kind of strong-armed Earl Warren into taking on the Warren Commission, because Warren did not want to do it initially, and that's how Johnson convinced him that we need to flesh this out so that 40 million people don't die.
Right. And then they can immediately close the books on this.
Yeah.
Close the books.
Yeah.
But
so if that were the case, okay, let's assume that for a second, because it was the height of the Cold War. Nuclear Armageddon was a real consideration. It still is, I guess, but in those days it was real.
Right.
So, if you put it in the context of that, I might can understand it, I guess. I don't think it's ever appropriate to lie to the American public, but I guess I can maybe understand it in the terms of that to prevent a war, if that's what your rationale was. But 61 years later, there ain't no more need to do that.
Right.
Okay?
And again, if there is a second shooter, and that would be the one who's in front of JFK, then that shooter was never brought to justice.
Yes.
And again, that shooter would probably be in his 80s or 90s today, and it's possibly that shooter is still alive.
Yeah. I think most people would say, oh, well, everybody associated with this is dead. Well, that's not necessarily true. There are still witnesses that are relevant to the case that are still alive. And presumably, yes, this person would be in their 80s or 90s, but that did not stop the pursuit of justice against Nazi war criminals. We saw them being brought to trial in their 80s and 90s.
That's right. And I think you had a case where you arrested somebody 30 years or so after the crime.
Yeah, this was one we've actually done talked about this previously on the podcast, in the case of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. That was done the day I was born, and I later arrested the guy that was involved in it, and he was over 70 years old at the time.
And he was successfully prosecuted for that crime.
Successfully prosecuted and died in prison.
Right.
As well he should have.
And again, when we were federal criminal investigators, if we presented what you have talked about in these 3 episodes, and we present this to a local prosecutor or to our local U.S. Attorney's office, and the victim was just some average person, not the former president of the United States, it's most likely that this case would be reopened and a second autopsy would be pursued.
It would, again, going back to forget emotion. Logically, yes, that's the path, the logical path to pursue. If you want to solve this thing, this is what can be done. It demands it almost.
Right. And this is, asking for the former president to be exhumed. That's a huge or big undertaking.
It is.
But we should note that President Kennedy has been exhumed before.
Yeah. Yeah, so when he was initially buried at Arlington Cemetery, it took 2 or 3 years to build a new, I don't know what you would call it exactly, but a grave site. And so his body was his coffin was exhumed to move it to the new burial site. I mean, just a few feet away and for a very short time, but nonetheless, that coffin has been exhumed previously.
Right. And we know that, in the news here recently, President Trump has talked about the releasing of additional classified files from the assassination.
Yes.
And maybe this will shed some light. Maybe it won't.
Yeah, you and I have just talked off air about what's going to be in there, and I don't think there's anything that's going to be in there that's going to be what we would call maybe an ops plan that just lays out everything and who did this and who did what and here's the real scoop. I don't think that document, if it ever existed, is not going to be in there. I think it's going to be more of an administrative thing that is going to be embarrassing to probably the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service. But again, that is absolutely no excuse that they need to be embarrassed, frankly.
Right. And when you talk about embarrassed, I think again, off air, we've talked about this, but there was a lot of information that the FBI had on Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes.
He was known to them.
And as they should. I mean, he had defected to the Soviet Union and then returned. He had a Russian wife. This is the height of the Cold War. Yes, they needed to keep tabs on him.
Right.
Absolutely they did. And is that something that they should have reported to the Secret Service at the time? Probably not. But this is something that, maybe a decision that was just made at the time that didn't happen. But Oswald was furious that they were trying to contact his wife, that the FBI had made attempts to talk to his wife. So he actually visited the FBI office and left a note, presumably that said, if you don't leave my wife alone, I'm going to blow up the FBI office. Now, that's not a specific threat to the president.
Right.
And that note, by the way, was later destroyed by FBI agent James Hosty at the order of the Dallas special agent in charge, which is both obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence, which is another huge problem. It might have been done just to stop embarrassment that,
Right.
hey, we knew about this guy and didn't stop him. But I don't care about embarrassment. We're way past that. So, but the issue is, should the Bureau have notified the Secret Service about, hey, you have this guy that he's really funky. He's been to the Soviet Union. He's come back. He's threatening to blow up the FBI office. That's not a specific threat to the president, but there is this wacky guy in Dallas you guys might want to check out.
Right. And what I find very interesting, that in November of 1963, a Gallup poll found that 52% of the people polled believed that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination of President Kennedy.
Wow, I'm surprised it's not higher. I've seen polls where it is higher than that.
And today,
Yeah.
today that poll, it's over 70% of Americans believe there was a conspiracy behind the assassination of President Kennedy.
And again, whether there was or wasn't, a lot of the reason that there's speculation about a conspiracy goes back to exactly what we're talking about today, are all the problems with this autopsy.
Right.
Whether all these problems were nefarious and there's something evil behind it, or whether it's just a series of mistakes and problems. And as we've said, in every investigation, I don't care how good you are, me included, mistakes are made.
Right.
Because we're humans, and especially in stressful situations. So, but regardless, whether it was mistakes or intentional things, the problem with this autopsy and the uncertainty of certain things is what has basically given fuel to speculation about conspiracy. And my whole point is it can end tomorrow with the second autopsy of the president.
It's
if there's
so
a gaping
necessary.
hole in that skull, then there was a conspiracy. If there's not a gaping hole, there was no conspiracy.
Exactly.
It's that simple. It's really that simple.
Simple and necessary.
Yes.
That gets done. So as we wrap up this episode on this 3-part series, I think this afternoon I'm going to go home and clear a spot on my bookshelf for a Peabody Award that we should win for this series. and again, a Peabody Award that recognizes outstanding achievements in media, and they're given for excellence in television, radio, podcasting, streaming, and other forms of media.
Todd, this honestly, it seems pretty obvious to me. And actually, I know that it was considered by the HSCA.
Right.
A second autopsy was considered. They didn't do it, but I'm just surprised that this is not more thought of, and that is a possibility. I think it falls back to this just emotional reaction that people have, is that, oh, you can't do that. Yeah, you can, and it does happen.
Happens all in cold cases all the time.
If we're talking about, if this were the case of John F. Smith, insurance salesman from the Midwest, it would happen without much thought, without much debate.
Right. It needs to happen. So join us on our next episode, Case 16, when we go back in crime and discuss a few gangsters from Chicago, a beautiful girl from Jacksonville, Texas, the FBI, and possibly the godfather of podcasting.
I love gangsters and gunfighters, so we'll get back to it.
That's Case 16. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And as a listener, hit that subscribe or follow button.
Absolutely. Keep it coming, guys. We love it.
Hope you enjoyed hearing this series, and if you did enjoy, let us know and share it with your friends.
This has been the Back in Crime podcast, presented by Texas crime travelers Todd Hiles and Stewart Fillmore. We are the executive producers. Grace Hiles is the producer and director. Theme music composed by Eddie Bandas. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and our YouTube channel at Texas Crime Travelers.